Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Council of Algorithms. Today, we will be talking about understanding ethics, the major ethical frameworks. So, in this series, we're exploring the different ideas that shape how people decide what is right, wrong, fair, and just. In our first episode, we asked a simple question: what is ethics? We discovered that ethics isn't simply about following laws or having opinions. Ethics is the process of thinking carefully about how we should act, how we should treat others, and what kind of world we're trying to build. But that naturally leads to another question: how do different people actually answer those ethical questions? Why can two thoughtful, intelligent people look at the exact same situation and arrive at completely different conclusions, while both genuinely believe they're doing the right thing? The answer is that they may be reasoning from completely different ethical frameworks. So today, we're going to introduce several of the most common ethical perspectives. This won't be an exhaustive philosophy course, and we might devote entire episodes to each of these later. But by the end of this video, I hope that you'll begin recognizing the different moral lenses that people use every day. So, what is an ethical framework? Imagine 6 people standing around the same sculpture. Each person sees the exact same object, but each person is standing in a different place. So no one is lying, no one is necessarily irrational. They're simply viewing the same object from different angles. Ethical frameworks work much the same way. They're different ways of asking what matters most. How should we make decisions? What makes something morally right? Each framework emphasizes different values. Sometimes they reach the same conclusion, but sometimes they don't. What's fascinating is that the disagreement isn't usually about the facts, it's about which values deserve the greatest priority. Understanding these priorities is key to understanding ethical disagreement. So let's talk about our first framework. Universal principles, or rules-based ethics. This approach assumes that certain rules or moral principles apply broadly across situations. Ethical behavior is determined by consistent adherence to these principles, even when outcomes or circumstances differ. So the first framework simply asks a question: what rule should always apply? So these ethics and principles should remain consistent regardless of the situation in this framework. So if lying is wrong, it's wrong. If stealing is wrong, then it's wrong. And if human rights deserve protection, well, then they deserve protection even when doing so is difficult. This approach values consistency. People should know what standards exist. Justice shouldn't depend on personalities or circumstances. If exceptions become too common, the rules lose meaning. One strength of this approach is fairness. Everyone is held to the same standard. The challenge is that life isn't always simple. Sometimes following one rule may conflict with another. Should you always tell the truth? Well, what if the truth would put someone's life in danger? Those difficult questions are exactly why other frameworks exist. Our next framework is particular duties, or situational ethics. This approach emphasizes context. Moral decisions depend on the specific situation, relationships involved, and real world consequences rather than fixed universal rules. So situation ethics asks, what does this particular situation require? So context matters, relationships matter, consequences matter. So rather than applying one universal answer to every circumstance, this framework argues that ethical decisions should adapt to the realities of each situation. Think about helping someone. Should you always keep a promise? Well, usually yes. But what if keeping that promise would seriously harm someone else? Situation ethics says context changes responsibility. This framework is flexible. It recognizes that real life is complicated. Its greatest strength is adaptability. Its greatest challenge is consistency. If every situation is unique, how do we avoid simply making exceptions whenever they're convenient? Our next ethical framework is character ethics, or sometimes called virtue ethics. This view focuses on who a person is rather than only what they do. Ethical action comes from developing virtues like honesty, courage, compassion, and integrity. Good character is shaped by cultural and social understanding. Instead of asking, what rules should I follow or what outcome should I produce, virtue ethics asks something entirely different. What kind of person should I become? The focus shifts away from isolated decisions. Instead, ethics becomes about developing character, honesty, courage, humility, justice, patience, compassion, integrity. According to this perspective, ethical actions naturally flow from ethical people. Rather than memorizing rules for every possible circumstance, we cultivate habits that guide us towards good decisions. Think about a trusted mentor. Why do you trust them? Probably not because they've memorized every ethical rule. You trust them because they've consistently demonstrated good character. Virtue ethics reminds us that morality isn't only about isolated choices, it's also about the kind of person we're becoming over time. For our fourth ethical framework, we're looking at self-actualization ethics. This perspective emphasizes personal growth and human potential. Ethical choices are those that support development, fulfillment, and alignment between work, identity, and purpose. This framework asks a different question altogether. What helps people become the best version of themselves? Here, ethics is closely connected to human growth, looking at learning, purpose, creativity, meaning, personal fulfillment. The assumption is that ethical environments allow people to flourish. Now, this doesn't simply mean chasing happiness, it means creating conditions where people can develop their abilities, contribute meaningfully, and live authentic lives. For example, an employer may ask, how do we build a workplace where employees thrive? A teacher may ask, how do I help students discover their strengths? A society may ask, what opportunities allow people to reach their potential? Ethics, in this view, isn't merely avoiding harm, it's actively encouraging human flourishing. Our fifth ethical framework is universal care. This approach prioritizes care, compassion, and reducing suffering for all people, especially those one is capable of helping. Moral action is defined through responsibility towards others' well being. Universal care begins with another important question: who needs care? This perspective emphasizes compassion, reducing suffering, meeting people's needs, supporting the vulnerable, helping others whenever we reasonably can. Rather than focusing primarily on rules or individual achievement, care ethics emphasizes responsibility towards other people. Sometimes, ethics looks less like enforcing justice and more like comforting someone who's hurting. It reminds us that kindness isn't separate from ethics, it's central to it. Think about healthcare or humanitarian aid, disaster relief or social work, or other charitable organizations you might be involved with. Many of these professions naturally emphasize care ethics because their mission begins with reducing suffering. The challenge is determining how broadly our responsibility extends. How much are we obligated to help? How should we balance caring for family, community, or strangers, and even future generations? Those questions become rich ethical discussions. And our last framework that we're talking about in this episode is relational ethics, or sometimes personal ethics. This view emphasizes trust, loyalty, and obligations formed through relationships. Moral decisions prioritize commitments to specific people over abstract rules or generalized principles. This framework shifts attention towards relationships and asks, what responsibilities arise because of the people I'm connected to? Unlike universal care, which seeks to help everyone broadly, relational ethics recognizes that certain relationships naturally create special obligations. Parents have responsibilities to their children. Friends owe loyalty to friends. Coworkers depend upon one another. Communities build trust through long-term commitments. This perspective argues that morality cannot ignore these relational bonds. Sometimes treating everyone identically actually ignores the unique responsibilities that relationships create. The challenge, of course, is balancing loyalty with fairness. Should you always support a friend? Well, what if they're wrong? Should family receive special consideration? Where does loyalty become favoritism or nepotism? These tensions make relational ethics both powerful and deeply practical. So here is something worth noticing. These frameworks often reach very similar conclusions for completely different reasons. Imagine someone who donates to a food bank. One framework says helping others is simply the right rule. Another might say this situation calls for compassion, while another person says a generous person naturally gives. Another framework might say helping others strengthens our shared humanity. And yet another says this allows both giver and receiver to flourish. And again, another might say my community depends on caring for one another. So the same action can exist for entirely different reasoning. This is one of the most fascinating parts of ethics. People often disagree less about what should happen than why it should happen. Understanding those reasons creates much better conversations. You might be asking yourself, why does this matter? Well, ethical disagreements can quickly become frustrating. We often assume someone who reaches a different conclusion must be uninformed or irrational or maybe uncaring. But many disagreements often come starting with different ethical priorities. One person begins with rules, another with compassion or relationships, while others begin with personal growth. Some might evaluate the context of a situation, while another are looking at a person's character. Recognizing those differences does not eliminate disagreement, but it does help us understand one another. And understanding is often the first step towards meaningful dialogue. Looking ahead, these 6 frameworks are only the beginning. In future episodes, we'll explore each one in much greater depth. We'll examine where they came from, their strengths, their limitations, and how they respond to real world ethical dilemmas. We'll also introduce some additional perspectives such as rights-based ethics and consequentialism to systems thinking, or justice, liberty, institutional ethics, and many others. The goal isn't to tell you which framework is correct. My goal is to help you recognize the different ways that thoughtful people reason about difficult questions. Because once you understand the frameworks, you begin hearing conversations differently. You stop hearing only conclusions, and you start to understand the values underneath them. As we close, remember that ethics isn't about memorizing the right answers. It's about learning how people reason, what they value, and why sincere disagreements exist. The more ethical frameworks we understand, the better equipped we become to evaluate our own beliefs, engage respectfully with others, and navigate the increasingly complex moral questions facing our world. So, next time, we'll begin exploring these perspectives one at a time, starting with one of the most oldest and most influential approaches to ethics. Until then, remember, understanding another perspective does not require agreeing with it, but it may help you understand both others and yourself a little better. Thank you for watching, and until next time, with perspective comes understanding. Thank you.